What's the purpose of a business? Is it just to make profit and increase shareholder value? Or with their activities, should businesses also take into account stakeholders, the public at large, the entire planet for that matter? So what would Hayek say? I'm Scott Nelson with the Austrian Economics Center and Hayek Institute in Vienna, Austria. And this week, we're going to be continuing our series on morality and the market by taking a look at what Hayek would have to say about corporate social responsibility. So in our first video on morality in the market, we emphasized the importance of individual responsibility, as well as the fact that there's not necessarily an equivalence, nor should there be, between moral merit and material reward. This week, we're turning from individuals to corporations, addressing specifically the issue of corporate social responsibility, or CSR. This is the idea that corporations shouldn't be driven by profit alone, but that they also have an obligation to society. This can include all sorts of endeavors, extending to philanthropic activities that go above and beyond the call of duty, or even political and social activism. Or CSR can also just be encapsulated what some might call the triple bottom line: people, planet, profit. Which means that in addition to making profit, a corporation must also ensure that it doesn't harm the environment and that people are treated fairly wherever the company operates. So, all of this raises the question, in whose interest should the corporation be run? Now, it just so happens that Hayek deals with this very issue in an article from 1960 called, revealingly enough, "The Corporation in a Democratic Society, in whose interest ought it to and will it be run?" So Hayek says that there are four groups in whose interest one could argue that a corporation should be run. He assumes that the most important group is self-evident, and so he doesn't include it in his list, and that's namely the customer. But the four groups he does mention are management, labor, so in other words, the employees of the company, stockholders or shareholders, and the public. So he dispenses pretty quickly with the first of those, management, and says that no one seriously believes that a corporation should be run in their interest. As for labor, the employees, Hayek concedes that a corporation will be sustained by the institutional knowledge amassed by its employees, their common experience and traditions, in other words, such that it would be very costly and inefficient if a corporation wanted to just do away with all of its employees simultaneously. So a corporation, in other words, does have a vested interest in retaining its staff. But he also warns against the danger of a corporation catering so much to its own employees that they become bound and overly dependent on the corporation, which means that the corporation has increasing power over its employees. Now, it's not entirely clear what Hayek has in mind here, since one of the things that could bind an individual to a corporation is higher pay and benefits, and what's wrong with that? But it seems that what Hayek is getting at are two other more pressing concerns. One is with maintaining the employee's right of exit. So that means their ability to decide whether the best use of their energies is within this corporation or in another corporation. And the other concern that Hayek has is that the corporation not cater so much to its own workforce that it's unable to serve the interest of consumers. So what about the other two interest groups, if you will, shareholders and public? Well, traditionally, Hayek says, the thinking is that these two interests can be reconciled insofar as an enterprise, by aiming at the highest possible return in the long run, will also best serve the public interest. The idea here is that shareholders will make profit only if people buy the company's products or services, and people will buy these products or services only if they're good. And if they're good, then the people, all of us, in other words, the customers, all of us will benefit. Or, as Hayek puts it, and I quote, "This contention is based on the assumption that each firm will in its decisions consider only such results as will affect, directly or indirectly, the value of its assets, and that it will not directly concern itself with the question of whether a particular use is socially beneficial. I believe this is both necessary and right under a regime based on the division of labor, and that the aggregation of assets brought together for the specific purpose of putting them to the most productive use is not a proper source for expenditure which is thought to be socially desirable. Such expenditure should be defrayed either by the voluntary payment of individuals out of their income or capital, or out of funds raised by taxation." Okay, so let's note first that Hayek here isn't necessarily opposed to socially beneficial undertakings, or, as he mentions at the end, individuals voluntarily paying for them or even being taxed for such purposes. In fact, he's quite in favor of private individuals or foundations or voluntary associations contributing to the public in some way, as historically they did in some places in establishing public education and public hospitals, libraries and museums, theaters and parks. What Hayek is more concerned with is the prejudice that holds that corporations must be the ones to undertake such socially beneficial activities. The popular view, as Hayek says, is that corporations are rich, and as a result, they have special duties. Here, however, Hayek disagrees. First, he says that where individuals can be rich in having a large disposable income or capital which they can spend on whatever they think is important, a corporation is not rich in this sense. And he goes on to say, in the strict sense, the corporation has no more in income of its own than a trustee has in his capacity of trustee. That its management has been entrusted with large resources for a particular purpose does not mean that it's entitled to use it for other purposes. He's, of course, also quick to note that that exact same kind of argument can be applied to how the money raised from your taxes is being used, but that's another matter. So Hayek is opposed to management spending a corporation's resources on socially beneficial activities because a corporation is not an individual. It should not be regarded in terms of its rights and activities as a person is, even if a corporation enjoys legal personality. And this is one of the reasons why Hayek says later in that same article that corporations that own stock in other corporations should not have voting rights in those other corporations, simply because this would accord too much power to those individuals who manage the corporation that holds the stock. But there's another problem that Hayek has with management deferring resources to socially beneficial activities. Namely, if management has this sort of power, then it will direct the corporation to serve ends that may not have been intended by those who provide the capital. And this shouldn't be so objectionable. I mean, if you think about it, if you invest your money or give it to someone and they spend it on what they want, not on what you want, or they end up losing your money, not turning a profit, then would you continue to trust that person with your money? Probably not. And in fact, you're under no obligation to do so because it's your money, your property. And the person who spent it or frittered it away has acted irresponsibly with your money, with your property. But the other problem with the logic that Hayek is criticizing here is that if one argues that management must serve wider public interests, then the next step would be to argue that representatives of the public interest should control the management. And so we come to the position that the corporation should in some way be subordinated to the state, and therefore subordinated to the vagaries of politics. But is it possible that what Hayek found particularly objectionable about management spending on socially beneficial activities is not necessarily the same as everything that's included under the rubric corporate social responsibility today? It seems fair enough to say that Hayek would have been opposed to funding diverted from a corporation's main purpose, which is to produce a good or a service and to make profit, in order to make philanthropic contributions or partake in social activism. But what about corporations having to take account of the effects that their activities have on people and the planet? Remember the triple bottom line that we discussed at the beginning of this video. Here I think he would be more permissive. And here's why. For one, Hayek would see corporations as responsible for certain negative externalities, such as to the environment. And you can check out our earlier video on environmentalism for more on that topic. He also notes in the beginning of the article that while the only specific purpose which corporations ought to serve is to secure the highest long-term return on their capital, this does not mean that in the pursuit of this end, they ought not to be restrained by general legal and moral rules, and that even certain generally accepted rules of decency, and perhaps even charitableness, should probably be regarded as no less binding on corporations than the strict rules of law. I must confess that this is all a little bit murky, because what are the generally accepted rules of decency? I mean, this is a sort of standard that changes over time, and it's highly dependent on what culture you're in. But it's important to note, however, for Hayek, that Hayek makes these allowances so long as these legal rules or moral rules are general. So when it comes to charitableness, I imagine that Hayek would have fewer problems with either moral pressure or a law stating that all corporations must give a portion of their profit to any charity or foundation of their choice. Where Hayek would be considerably more opposed is if only some corporations, say from a particular sector, had to give away a portion of their profit, or if corporations had to give away a portion of their profit, but only to particular charities or foundations. All right, so to recap, one of the going concerns in Hayek's article is that management might have been engaged in what they deemed to be socially beneficial activities against the will of the shareholders. His answer to the problem had been to transfer power from management to the shareholders, since the latter's devotion to profit was probably more reliable than the former's. And lest we forget, the corporation belongs to the shareholders, not to management. But what happens if the shareholders are really keen on philanthropic activities, social activism? In other words, on all the stuff, the varieties of corporate social responsibility that Hayek disagreed with. Moreover, what if the consumers, us, what if we are just as keen on corporate social responsibility? If you're of the opinion, as I would say Hayek generally is, that there is a strict equivalence between profit-making and serving the public interest, then you would want to change the mentality among the public that supports economically wasteful forms of CSR. And we'll see how this relates to Hayek's larger scheme of the Great Society in a future video. But there's another question. Is CSR something that we actually all want? Are we, the consumers, perfectly aware of every single link in the supply chain that provides us with the goods or services we desire? Moreover, are we aware of all of the potential negative externalities of each and every link in that supply chain? Probably not. It's rather complex, and we probably have better things to do with our time. If, for example, though, a company sells drinks and their direct business practices are sound, but let's say, for instance, that their bottler, one of the links in the supply chain, is less kind to people or to the planet, is not so socially responsible, then should the company selling our drinks to us be shamed for not switching bottlers? But if so, why should the buck stop there? Because the ultimate guilty party is us, the consumers. But here I'm drifting into another issue, which is boycotting. The other thing, to come back to the topic, the other thing I wanted to ask is, how seriously do corporations take corporate social responsibility? If a corporation puts on a show of how environmentally friendly it is this simply meant to distract consumers from the corporation's main activities, which might not be as appealing to some consumers? Some corporations' dedication to corporate social responsibility then is perhaps more strategic than it is moral. But if the outcomes are good, is it excusable? All of these questions force us to be honest with ourselves about the trade-offs we're willing to put up with in terms of buying the goods and services we want from corporations whose business practices we may or may not entirely agree with. For the time being, various understandings of corporate social responsibility will be with us for the foreseeable future. It was even one of the metrics in the Drucker Institute's 2020 company ranking. The top 5 companies were the usual suspects: Microsoft, Apple, IBM, Amazon, and Alphabet, Google's parent company. And in fact, 4 of the 5 metrics correspond to what we were saying at the beginning about whose interests one could argue a corporation should serve. So the companies were evaluated on customer satisfaction, employee engagement and development, social responsibility, and financial strength. But whether a company leans more in the direction of corporate social responsibility, or increasing shareholder value, or employee development and engagement, or customer satisfaction, or what have you, every company rather, would do well not to forget the 5th metric of company performance: innovation. And that's what Hayek would say.
This guy is awesome. He's got a lot of great stuff to say. I hope you've really been enjoying our videos. If you have, and if you'd like to hear what Hayek has to say about something else, anything, then let me know in the comments. And please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends.